indications. I was under the impression that you could only get an indication if you did adequate and well-controlled trials in the pediatric population. That if the approval was based on extrapolation of efficacy from adults, that you couldn't actually get an indication. You could call a usage and you would describe the basis of approval in pediatric use. Is that correct or not?
So you can obtain a pediatric indication based upon extrapolation from adult efficacy studies with additional data, safety data in pediatric patients and pharmacokinetic data in pediatric patients. So the answer is yes, you do not need an adequate and well-controlled study in pediatric patients in certain situations to obtain an indication in pediatric patients, but you do need that additional data.
I'm going to the back of the line.
Okay, do you see that? She went to the back because she had a follow-up question.
Can you provide labeling implications for an orphan indication that may actually affect younger patients if it's genetically derived? In other words, can you potentially use clean animal tox data to support the label for pediatric and/or pregnancy?
Well, I think this will go, thank you for the question, by the way. I think I will go back to the original focus of the meeting and the presentation, that this is really more about how to communicate information and labeling, how to distribute it, rather than the standards, the evidentiary standards needed to support that. I know we have a lot of pediatricians in the room from the division that probably could help you with that type of question. But did you want to phrase it from a labeling perspective?
Yes. I mean, I'm wondering what you do with an orphan drug. I mean, because there were some accelerated approvals, and orphan can fall into that. I just kind of wanted to ask a little bit more detail around orphan specifically.
Maybe we could talk about that later. Yeah, because and to get more clarification on your question. Thank you.
All right, let's sneak in an online question before we come back to the microphones.
I have a question directed to Dr. Brodsky. For pediatric information, what would warrant a separate USPI for the pediatric population?
The question is with respect to having one or two, my understanding, labeling documents with respect to one drug. And we have some general considerations about whether you have one labeling document or two labeling documents, potentially for two different dosage forms. So in general, if the conditions of use are similar, such as the indications are similar, the healthcare provider audience is similar, and the safety, the warnings and precautions, the safety concerns are similar, it may be optimal to have one labeling document, for example, two different dosage forms. One dosage form, maybe an oral solution, is for pediatric patients and potentially adults, and a tablet form is only for adults and adolescents. That is particularly important potentially because if you have two labeling documents, you could get divergence of information pretty rapidly. It's harder to track. And potentially a healthcare provider can compare the differences between the dosage forms within one document, with one place. However, if you have two different dosage forms, for example, and it may even be the same active moiety, but they're different, vastly different conditions of use, it may be more appropriate to have two different labeling documents. And you could give the example, let's say, of an NSAID, for example. Maybe you have an NSAID for an ophthalmic solution for a particular ophthalmology indication versus an oral NSAID. It can have a topical NSAID, maybe not very little systemic exposure, versus an oral NSAID, maybe a lot of systemic exposure. Different indication, different healthcare provider audience, different safety conditions or considerations. So there it may make sense to have two different labeling documents.
All right, microphone number 1, please.
I want to echo, I thought that was an interesting question about two labeling documents because that's come up and it's always an interesting discussion. My question, however, is more on the PLLR front, so whoever wants to take this one, please do, is on, have you seen issues around off-label use impacting decisions in this space? I can say for CDER, so we have a number of vaccines only indicated for use in children where we're able to take a certain path, but for one vaccine there was a comment that it might in fact be used off-label into an adolescent population, so a different approach was taken. So have you seen any comments on the CDER side?
Yes, we have seen, so in terms of off-label use, it affects the omissions part of the, Dr. Baisden had talked about. So if there is anticipated off-label use, it might affect what statements get included under PLLR. For example, if it's a drug that's only indicated in males, for example, for prostate cancer, then we don't necessarily include like the background risk statement under 8.1. And there would be a statement that would be included under 8.1 that say, this product is not indicated for females. So it depends on, what the drug, what the anticipated off-label use is, and kind of what gets omitted and gets kept. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis.
Microphone number 2, nice and close for me, please.
I have a separate question, but just to follow up on my first one is the statement. In the late 1990s, we had an antibiotic, and we had one of the indications for pediatric get approved based on efficacy extrapolation from adults. The other indications were all based on adequate, well-controlled doses in children. We could not get a formal indication for that extrapolated indication. We had dosaging and we had dosing information. We had a usage, but it was not specifically in the indication. And I can write the name of the drug down later if you want to look at it. My question was, can any of you give us some recent examples just for reference of drugs where there's a limitations of use statement or warning and precaution statement based on an unapproved indication? Just an example that we can look at.
As a general matter, so for these labeling conferences, what we try to do is really de-identify drugs, indications, just more as a global discussion, as opposed to specific example in labeling. So that's as a general matter, just trying to bring out general principles to the discussion.
Okay, could we sneak in an online question, please?
Yes, this was addressed to Dr. Trentacost, and it's referencing that you spoke of that a label is not read like a book from top to bottom. Each section is somewhat considered its own document. Therefore, should the formatting guidance of defining each abbreviation at its first use in the highlights, full prescribing information, and patient labeling be expanded to define the first use of an abbreviation at the first instance of each individual section?
So that's a great question, and unfortunately we don't have guidance about that. However, I can tell you that there are review teams who do use that approach, meaning they do see each succinct section, highlights as one area where they'll first define an acronym, and then each other section, let's say section 7, section 14, they'll define that acronym again in each section. But we have other divisions who will define an acronym first time that acronym is used. So unfortunately, we don't have a consistent approach. I think that's used universally. Obviously, we recommend defining all acronyms at least once when they're used, first time minimum approach. But I think, for instance, if it's a very long disease like non-small cell lung cancer, everybody kind of knows that acronym, but maybe a less common acronym, maybe it's very important to define that in each subsection.
All right, microphone number 1, nice and close for me, please.
Hi, this is related to pregnancy warnings. Is there a difference between the terms women of childbearing potential or reproductive potential?
Okay, thank you. That was a very good question because we are in a period of transition. Women of childbearing potential, women of reproductive potential are essentially the same population. You will see in our labels we're actually using the term females of reproductive potential to try to capture a broader width of women that could potentially become pregnant, because all females includes adolescents who are then have passed through a stage of puberty, and they then become females of reproductive potential. So it's a much broader categorization, and that's why we're using the term females of reproductive potential.
Microphone number 2.
Yes, I had a question for Dr. Dinatale. It's regarding 8.3, females and males of reproductive potential, and the guidance indicates that you should include requirements or recommendations for pregnancy testing and or contraception before, during, or after drug therapy. And so my question is it required to indicate how long after drug therapy should a patient continue on contraceptive therapy? And if so, what is the guidance that FDA would provide in that regard?
Thank you for that question. So we do tend to, when we do recommend contraception, we'll include, the drug contraception should be used during the drug therapy, and then usually we'll have a period of time after. So it depends. I mean, sometimes we'll look at the half-life of the drug. There's usually a discussion that we have with the clinical pharmacology staff because, we look at the property of the drug itself. So it's sometimes not just the half-life. There are other things that we kind of just, consider. So basically, it's a group effort to try to determine what that timing is. There are certain groups that have guidances, like the oncology group has a guidance that came out, and they look at different things to determine the timing, like the genotoxicity of the drug. So that's something else. If it's an oncology product, there are other considerations in terms of timing to use contraception after the drug therapy.
Okay, let's take an online question, please, Ray.
Thank you, Jeff. Clinicians commonly ask for more interpretation of the pregnancy and lactation section. What is being done to help with this need? Many non-physicians, prescribers, don't have the science background to interpret the data, and even physicians find studies difficult to interpret from a clinical perspective. What can be done?
Thank you for that question. It's one we struggle with as well. But we'd like to point out that there are many non-physician reviewers in O&D, and especially on our maternal health team, who are reviewing and writing the PLLR labeling. Although there are many non-physician prescribers also should have some scientific background to be able to help them interpret the data. However, we have gotten a lot of feedback that this is a big change, going from letter categories to this PLLR system. And in fact, as we mentioned during our presentation, there was a risk communication advisory committee that we held in 2018. And the purpose of that meeting was to discuss what's being presented in the pregnancy section of labeling and what we can do to improve the way that we're presenting this information to help prescribers, physician or non-physicians, in their understanding and in their communication with their patients about the available data that we do have. And some of the feedback that we got is that we should actually do end user testing. So test these healthcare prescribers, physician and non-physicians group, and get their feedback on what they're understanding about PLLR, what they're not, where are the gaps, how can we be more clear in our language. And so the agency, as we mentioned briefly in our presentation, is doing a research project to engage healthcare providers and prescribers in this effort and to get their feedback and to look for ways that we can improve. And we're also doing this for lactation, not just pregnancy. We're seeking funding for lactation as well. Thank you.
All right, microphone number 2, nice and close, please.
This is a question in regards to the PLLR presentation. On one of the slides, you mentioned the 2018 cohort and the 2019 cohort, and then a subsection regarding specific number of applications that are under review. When you say under review, does that mean those applications have received the acknowledgement and PDUFA dates? And if not, how many divisions are experiencing backlogging for the applications?
That was a good question. So you're saying, you're asking for clarification about what it means when applications are under review. And then your second question was about backlogging? Okay. So when the slide stated that the application was under review, that means it has been submitted, and currently the agency reviewers are looking over the application and considering the labeling changes. So that's what it means by currently under review. That's usually a 6 to 10 month clock, depending on the type of application that has been submitted. As far as backlog, it's a difficult question to answer. We are all working to get these labels reviewed and get as many out as quickly as possible to get that public health safety information available, especially as we are trying to, in this effort, bring in what is currently known based upon the years of data that have been collected for some of these drugs. So I don't think there is a good response for talking about backlog. We are tracking it. We're not noting a remarkable backlog. Again, we're working efficiently to address and turn over these applications because there are so many. Any other comments?
Just to add to Tamara's comments, so one of the challenges with PLLR implementation is the number in terms of the duration of the implementation period. If you look at PLR implementation, it was over a 5-year period, a longer period. PLLR is under a 3-year period. And PLR involved about 600 NDAs and BLAs. PLLR involves 1,700 north of that. So you're dealing a lot, although PLLR is a smaller amount of the labeling you're dealing with compared to PLR, you're just dealing with sheer numbers and much a shorter duration of time. So that's one of the challenges with PLLR implementation. And I think we learned a lot. I think we're bringing a lot of what we learned from PLR implementation into PLLR. For example, sending reminder letters to application holders. I think DPMH has done an excellent job just reminding people with respect to when and there's a trigger for PLLR. So those are some of the challenges.
All right, microphone 2 again, please. Nice close.
Hi. You might have recently just answered this question. It's regarding pregnancy, but I wanted to ask it just because I get it fairly often. And the recent new drug approvals, I've noticed some have the line in there that the product should be only used during pregnancy if the benefit outweighs the risk. Some refer to contact your physician, and some say neither. So I've had healthcare practitioners ask me, what should I tell them? And because if it really isn't saying much in the label except for a lot of animal data that they don't understand, quite frankly, and they're referring to ask the physician, or the label doesn't say anything regarding about what should be done for use in pregnancy. I guess my question is, with the new look at the at PLLR, will consideration be given about uniform direction on what to say regarding use in pregnancy?
The question is about taking a uniform look for use in pregnancy. And I think that is something that's difficult to achieve because we are considering so many different aspects, and with the scarcity of data. We do have to consider the indicated population, understand how, frequently the drug may be used in females of reproductive potential. Thank you. And so it often is a difficult discussion that we have with the entire review team. And if you do recall, when the physician's labeling rule came through, this portion was held up for a number of years because folks had difficulty agreeing on the approach. We moved from pregnancy categories, and when the proposed rule came forward, it had various sentences where folks were trying to have some top-level statements, but there wasn't agreement reached. So I think this continues to be a challenging space, and to have uniformity is difficult. I do understand what you're saying in that the way that it should be communicated can be clear to the prescriber so they can understand how to discuss and to counsel their patient. And that's something that we do appreciate. We took away the comments from the communication experts, and we're really trying our best to help craft language, especially in the risk summary area, so that we can better help you understand what does that animal data mean. But I think it's difficult to always have the same message when there are different circumstances and different risks that are associated with the different drugs.
All right, online question, please.
Can 18-year-olds be included in the enrollment of the pediatric study?
So I can answer it from a labeling perspective. So I know, so from a regulatory perspective, there are different definitions of pediatric patients, but from a regulatory labeling perspective, we define pediatric patients, patients less than 17 years old. There has definitely been an encouragement to include pediatric patients, particularly adolescents, in certain circumstances in adult trials. So the trials would include adult patients and pediatric patients. So with respect to developing, what are the considerations of how to develop subsection 8.4 or section 14 in that circumstance? So in that circumstance, one would include, as typically done, a detailed description of the study designs and the results in section 14. But one key consideration in this situation in subsection 8.4, you would probably, if the data is pooled in 14 between adolescents and adults, in subsection 8.4, it would be optimal to pull out what's the pediatric exposure, how many adolescents were there. That would be a key difference there.
All right, another online question, please, Ray.
What is the threshold or sufficiency of data for inclusion in the label, particularly in the pregnancy human data section?
Thank you for that question. And I guess the response would be that we don't have a set threshold or a standard threshold.
Radio interference.
Okay, so as far as a threshold for including a human pregnancy data section, we really don't have a standard threshold. We consider each application individually on a case-by-case basis, and what we're really looking at is the types of available data that we have. Is it just case reports? Is it pregnancy exposure data from a registry? And we're considering the quality of the available data. Is this based on epidemiological studies versus a small case series? The rarity of the disease. We have many considerations, and so we don't have a standard threshold. We do try to include data for prescribers when we do think that it is sufficient, because we want to be helpful. But we also, it's a slippery slope. You don't want to be misleading about safety when really we don't think the data is sufficient. So there are times when we do not include a human data section. It's really a case by case.
Okay, we take about 4 more minutes. If there's any questions in the room, come up with a mic, but let's take the next online question, please. or not. Let's go to a microphone question.
Is there any movement towards standardization or preference in the way age categories or ages of children are expressed? Because you see it kind of all over the place in labeling, 12 to under 17 or 12. Is there any movement towards standardization? Or
Great question. So there, I know CDER and ICH have different definitions of children. So as we know, neonates, children, adolescents, given that the recommendations, at least in the pediatric labeling guidance, are to use the term pediatric patients or pediatric population if you're dealing with in a preventive situation, potentially like a vaccine situation, when you have healthy subjects. So we typically use terminology like in patients, pediatric patients, and include age groups.
Okay. And now let's go to an online question.
By adding a limitations of use for disease B, will that not promote use for an unapproved indication in the U.S.?
So, as I mentioned, any description of any unapproved use has to come with some kind of disclaimer statement stating that the product, either the safety and effectiveness has not been established for the treatment or use in that condition, or the product is not indicated. So I think if those statements are clearly there, I don't think necessarily that would may promote unapproved use, because usually in that setting, we're describing some kind of risk associated with that unapproved use as well.
Okay. Do we have another one from online?
Should rationale for omissions also be a part of supporting information submitted in Module 1?
So thank you for that question. Yes, so if you do have any rationale for omission, Module 1 would be the place to include it with your PLLR submission.
Okay. Another one from online? One more? There we go.
How does FDA define verifying pregnancy status versus pregnancy testing? Can verification be a verbal conversation, medical record review, etc.? And if verification is determined by these routes, is a pregnancy test required?
Can you give me that one more time while they mull it over?
How does the FDA define verifying pregnancy status versus pregnancy testing? Can verification be a verbal conversation, medical record review, etc.? And if verification is determined by these routes, is a pregnancy test required?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so that's a discussion that the physician would have with the pregnant, with the patient. So it's not something where we're going to put it into labeling about, the type of testing, when it's going to be done. So again, it's a discussion that needs to be had by the prescriber and their patient.
I'll just add that may include obtaining a pregnancy test, but the clinician certainly can use their own judgment. If there's patients had a hysterectomy, for example, there's really no need. They can verify by taking a history from a patient. They don't necessarily have to run a pregnancy test if they feel it's not clinically indicated.
Okay, and that is all the time we have for questions. Please help me thank our panel for taking the time to